right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Launch and Learn series. I am Miracle Obiora, a digital marketing intern here at Futuresoft. Launch and Learn is a bi-weekly program where each staff gets to train people on topics relating to our industry. If today is the first time of joining us, you're welcome. David Woruka, our head of branding and design, will be facilitating today's session on the topic, brand management, getting it right end to end. Kindly mute your mic as we continue with the session. And if you have questions to ask as the session goes on, kindly drop them in the chat and it will be addressed by David after his presentation. Thank you for your cooperation. Over to you, David. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Miracle, for the introduction. So good afternoon, everyone. Once again, my name is David Woruka, and I'm a designer at Futuresoft, and today we'll be looking at brand management. So basically just going through some points, on how to get it right, basically from end to end. So I'll go through the overview. So we'll just do a brief overview of the session, the purpose of it. I'll go through some definitions, look at why brand management matters, some ways to approach it, and then the final, thoughts for the day. So primarily, I put this session together because, we live in an era where, there's a lot of, presence, digital presence, and there's a lot of information going around. Things, are becoming less and less difficult to be hidden. So as a brand, you can't just say, oh, this is what we do. This 2025, not 2005. In 2005, you could say certain things and it's far more difficult for people to fact check, but the world we live in right now, you have a lot of people with mobile and digital devices. If something happens today in Abuja, in a few minutes, as long as it can be captured on a mobile device, it's actually circulating, even possibly at a global level, so, for brands to actually, be effective during this period, brand management is actually key in that. So why we are looking at trends to tap into, we're looking at ways to be innovative, we're looking at incorporating, evolving technology into brands, at the core of it, or it's the effective management, that effective management is really the silent driver, and a lot of people don't really put this together. People jump on trends, people look at a couple of things that are going on and they try to integrate if it is, a new technology, if it's a new, maybe social movement, they try to plug into it. And eventually, a lot of people don't really look at how this come together to really create an effective brand for them, and they approach it very disjointedly, and it creates, a lot of inconsistency for some brands. You have situations where brand lose equity, and a lot of opportunities are lost. So why there are some brands that are getting it wrong, of course, there are a couple of brands still doing it right. So but the whole purpose of this, is just so that we can understand why brand management matters, and to look at, effective ways to implement, brand management practices. So yeah, let's unpack it. So defining the core. What's brand management? Brand management, it's not just one thing, it's a process. And that process involves, building, maintaining, and evolving your brand so that it aligns, with goals you set for the brand or for the business. You can connect emotionally with your customers, and then you can eventually sustain the value over time. We have some brands that have been around for almost 100 years, over 100 years, a couple of them they've been around for that long. And trust me, that's effectiveness of brand management in place. So at its core, it's basically defining what a brand stands for, understanding its purpose, value, positioning, ensuring, stays consistent and compelling, in how it communicates. It's managing the experiences across touch points, whether it's the human experience, digital experience, whatever experience, associated with your brand, ensuring that you're managing it across all touch points. And then also measuring and protecting the brand perception and also its reputation. So it's combination of being strategic, being creative, and also it involves operation. Because no matter how strategic or creative you are, if there's no execution, your brand management won't be effective as well. So all this working together, to ensure that the brand doesn't just exist but thrives, especially today where, people have loads of messages hitting them left and right, both from traditional media, to digital media. So to put this in perspective, in a more relatable terms, think of your brand like raising a child, you know, you don't just name the child, buy them clothes and hope for the best. Basically you raise them, and you raise them by teaching them values. You raise them by, helping them to build character. You guide their choices, and eventually you protect their reputation. You help them in all these areas. So that's what brand management is basically. So it's basically like helping your brand, to grow in the right direction, adapting to changes, handling mistakes, very important, you know, and preparing it to thrive, in the world. And why, of course, in all of this, it's still staying true to its identity. So if you think of brand management, just think about parenting. So brand management is basically parenting your brand. So I think that's just one way to drive it home so that it sticks easily to understand. In all complexity, brand management is just basically parenting your child. So I have these quotes from, or excerpts, not exactly quotes, these are excerpts from Seth Godin and David Breyer. Um, so why I've put this in place is to still drive home, as to the importance of brand management. For Seth Godin, he says that brand management is expectations, set of expectations of memories, stories, and relationships that taken together account for a customers or consumers, like a brand, yeah, is consumers' decision to choose one product, service over another. So that's what, a brand is. But David Breyer went ahead and said that if you don't give the market the story to talk about, they will define your brand story for you, and it won't be the story you want. So if your brand is the set of expectations, memories, stories, and relationship, so that means, according to David Breyer, you have to give the market, what they have to expect of that brand. You have to be the one to set that expectation, set the memories, the stories, and the relationship you want to build for them. So if you don't give the market those expectations, if you don't give them those memories, you don't give them those stories and those relationships, then they will define it for you. And it will definitely not be what you want it to be. So um, going into details as to why brand management matters. So one, it enhances, recognition and recall. So I've talked about the fact that we're in a hyper digital era where messages are hitting people daily, you know, only well-managed brands will eventually stand out. So here's an analysis, a report presented 2,500 customers with 10 branding color palettes and asked them to guess the brands. 91% correctly guessed Google just from its, shade of blue, green, and yellow and red, which Google is always consistent with that color. So, but imagine if, let's say, there are times where, with how vast Google is in terms of its product offerings and how big of a conglomerate it is. I don't think there's anywhere in the world Google doesn't have presence. Even in China, I think there's an alternative for Google, still run by Google, I think so. But imagine with that vastness of Google, if, sometimes, maybe when they want to represent the Google logo, the G is not taking the blue, it's probably taking the green. Those are some of the things that inconsistent management could do. And for brands that are actually global and worldwide, that's kind of deliberate consistency cuts through the clutter, through the noise, and it helps consumers to instantly recall, So, and that's why I've actually placed this statistic here. So you understand, so for a brand to be consistent, it's not something you just take lightly, because the consumers or your customers, they actually pay attention. They actually pay attention. And one little drop in quality, one little drop, would say this doesn't feel like this. This is probably not original, this is probably fake, and we do that a lot, even as experts. And sometimes when we are customers, we don't pay attention to the fact that, the things we actually preach, we eventually practice it as customers as well. Or the things we forewarn other business owners, we forewarn business owners as experts. We practice it as well as customers, which is sometimes we're looking at products and we're really trying to vet when we look at the packaging. There's something off. The color looks faded, and little things like this. Sometimes we make decisions, purchasing decisions. And if you're a brand that's not consistent with the state, if you're not checking the quality, of your packaging, for instance, oh, you're putting out this packaging and you're not seeing the fact that, oh, your packaging is, let's say, yellow, and you're realizing that these shades of yellow we're putting out, it's looking pale, it's looking faded, maybe we need to trash this set of packaging. Whatever the issue is, we need to fix it. You put it out there. The batch of that product could go out and you may never just get sales because people feel this is like not the original version. This is like a knockoff of the original brand. And we look out for these things on a daily basis. So ensuring that you're deliberate with how consistent your colors are, your outlook are in every ramification, not just colors alone, but when you are that meticulous, in watching your brand, it actually, makes like a lot of impact eventually on your consumers. Then, of course, also it drives like, additional tangible business values, aka brand equity, So when you're talking about brand equity, it's just, the perception tied to your brand, not just how well the brand is performing, but what the consumers really think of your brand, like that place in the hearts of the consumer they've placed you. Do they place you as a premium brand? Or do they feel like these people are jokers? Do they feel like you're very serious? Do you feel like you care about the environment? Do they feel like you care about, evolving social challenges, do they feel like you're inspiring? So that place you have in the heart of the customer is what brand equity, is. And equity is basically you ensuring that you place right as well in the heart of the customer. And you can't do that by being random. Nike, for instance, if I pick somebody random here, to describe Nike on an average, you are going to start telling me about an athlete who probably feels this weight. And by the time they are tying on their Nike shoes, they're becoming motivated. Yeah, seeing how they want to overcome some of the goals, they want to overcome challenges, you know. And the reason why you already have that perception about Nike, it's because virtually everything you're seeing about the brand has actually reflected that over the years, But it's also important to understand that, saying these things, putting these things out in communication and carefully crafting them also requires you to also leave them, as a brand. So, and for most brands, who has actually done this effectively, is because they've been able to live it. And one of the brands I stated is Apple. Apple at its early stage, portray themselves as we're a product not for everybody. We're a product for individuals who are secluded. They had this campaign which think different, and they just kept making you understand, like, see, this is for the rebels, this is for the people who are not the regulars, and they're not for this, not for that, just think different. Apple over time had positioned themselves that way, and even with how they structure their product and services, they've positioned themselves that way over the years. And in recent times, there's been a lot of, let's say, controversies, when associated with Apple. And I remember, I'll say maybe for like the past 4 years, I've always had this back and forth with one of my brothers, and he always talked about the fact that, the Apple has not been exactly innovative when it comes to their iPhones. And he wonders why, people keep buying it. And I always laugh and I'll tell him that it's because of equity, that first, this is a brand that has clearly been in the forefront of innovation. And I'll list a couple of things these guys, invented like before them, we didn't have devices like this. That's one, that they've been in the forefront of innovation. And he talked about the fact that one of the things he sees the fact that a lot of people who use iPhones just because they feel like they just want to be on the class of their own. And I would laugh and I'll say, but exactly, that's part of the Apple's ideology. It's the fact that they always design their product knowing fully well that they want to be secluded. So if you have Google where, they integrate most of their products, where it's accessible everywhere, and Apple tries to keep more of like a closed circuit, that's part of their ideology and it still works for them. and eventually, with all the complaints, that still goes around iPhones, with the fact that people keep slamming, you still see people who slam Apple, but they still use the Apple iPhone. And that's just what equity does. It can help you command premium pricing. It can help you expand into new markets easily. It can help you withstand PR crisis better and also attract loyal customers who become brand advocates. So no matter how you hate Apple, their relevance is still there, and that's because they still have values. And I remember one of the situations to where we're still discussing, we're talking about computer chips, talking about different gaming laptops and ones that are suited maybe for editing, graphics, stuff. And he started highlighting how the fact that, oh, right now Apple is actually at the forefront, of chip development, and they have one of the best in the market. And I started laughing. And I told him, you see what I was telling you? That the fact that they may not be getting it right, when it comes to the iPhone right now, hasn't really changed the fact that these guys still know what they're doing and they're still putting out their best, and we laughed over that, but basically, but they've been deliberate to communicate a certain perspective that even when there are, let's say doubts about the product quality or concerns about the product, it's actually still helped them to still command that premium pricing and to still withstand, over the years and to still stay as one of the top valuable brands, in the world, and also one of the top most valuable companies as well in the world. So another point, it drives customer loyalty and everything I've just talked about, with the whole equity, it's still, what, effective brand management does when you carefully craft your brand where people can recognize it and recall it. You're conscious about, how you want your brand to be perceived to build that equity. Eventually, it'll drive, that loyalty. And I want to paint a quick scenario here, which is, to make you understand, it's not just about discounts, if you want, you do a promo that will create commitment, so people choose you even when there are cheaper or trendy alternatives. I talked about Apple a lot around this, and I'm sure most of us are familiar with, the whole Apple or Samsung iPhone beef. And I think maybe even Google Pixels getting into that conversation right now, So, but a simple scenario would be, imagine an e-commerce gets a surge during Black Friday, that usually happens towards the end of the year, but let's suppose sales, deliveries are delayed, emails go unanswered, and their tone online becomes very professional and rude, and compare that, contrast it with another brand that followed up each, with a thank you email, gifts, product updates, product care tips, and even birthday greetings, with a month later. Black Friday, oh, usually around end of November. So imagine if maybe there's a Christmas sale coming or there's a Christmas stuff campaign coming or Valentine's Day coming, which of the brands do you think, customers will want to go for? Customers want to go for the brands that actually ensure that everything actually works smoothly. So you can actually offer discounts and actually do promos. You can do Black Friday sales, but you cut cost for people, but you're rude to them. You don't answer their requests. You don't really follow through with a lot of process. The stuff they need that they need are delayed. Eventually, it's just going to be a failure, but when you can actually craft and carefully plan the entire process, where it's not just about offering something that looks good, but ensuring that you follow through the process where the experience from the start to the end is actually very excellent and smooth and seamless, then if you don't do that, you will not actually have like customers who eventually be loyal no matter what you offer. So, and managing the entire process, just beyond the products and offering, but ensuring that the entire experience is consistent is actually very key. And that's what, that's the area where brand management as well comes in driving customer loyalty and lifetime value. So yeah, of course, it also helps align internal culture, So if your employees don't understand, what your brand stands for, they are most likely just work in silos, deliver inconsistent service, and fail to embody the brand's purpose. So why we're talking about why it matters, there's a session in this training where we'll look into some of this, in terms of like some of the things to check for to know the signs of, when the brand is ineffective. And I'll still touch some of those points, but from a different angle as well. So but when your team is aligned, through a clear brand message, internal communication, and cultural rituals, they will live the brand, and when they do, the customers will feel it. So when I talk about cultural rituals, I'm not talking about KOK. So, uh, well, maybe I'll explain that in details, but here at Future, so we have something to call family values, and there are times where we have, our meetings and we have to go over these things over and over to ensure that everyone gets it. And there's a common statement, we always use at Future Stuff, the extra mile. So little things like this are important, how you are careful about actually reiterating the vision, the mission, the values of the brand, actually helps, internal organization to be effectively aligned with the brand. And according to Essential, the 65% of customers globally say that purchasing decisions are influenced by the words, values, and actions of a company's leader. So basically, when you are part of a brand, your customers are also watching you. And especially now where people can easily take videos of you and post online unsolicited, so we see cases where people are in an establishment and when the services are poor, they're not just even complaining, they're not shouting, they just secretly take videos and then they post it online and slam the organization. And before you know it, you have to start doing a lot of, reputation management, but when you can effectively, manage even the internal culture, it also helps. And when the internal culture is properly aligned, it also shapes the external perception. So, and that's one of the benefits as well. Of course, it prepares you for evolution, So when you are a strategic brand, you're not just static, so you must adapt. But adapting doesn't mean just jumping on trends. For instance, in 2025, brands are expected to at least, not at least, they're expected to be more sustainable, inclusive, tech-savvy, community-driven. But these are not trends. These are actually important things. So when we're saying brands are expected to be sustainable, we're not telling you to come and start celebrating, oh, this, that date, the other day, it's really about looking into your process. And strategic brands as well didn't actually have to wait, to get to this point where these are hot topics. There have been brands where from their packaging, they've actually invested over the years to ensure that they use, um, like clean process in the development of their packaging. Some they are trying to see how they limit, the emission, of CO2, trying to see how they use more of clean energy, see how they use biodegradable packagings, stuff that when you're done using, it doesn't just stay, like you will have a lot of plastics, you move around, certain areas in Lagos, you just see the waterways are blocked, you see a lot of plastic just litter, these things are not decaying, and a lot of organizations, before this starts to become an issue, before it starts to become a global hot topic, they're already seeing things they could do, to ensure that they curb it, and those are the ones that are actually leading when it comes to sustainability. And when it comes to actually also being inclusive as well, a lot of companies that has actually been deliberate in terms of seeing how, there's representation in terms of culture, in terms of tribe, in terms of religion, in terms of race, depending on the region where they find themselves. And then of course, when you talk about being tech savvy, don't jump on AI because everybody's talking about AI, but strategic brand understands where they are aligned with this, So part of why I stated this as well is to point out the fact that when you're strategic as a brand, you don't just evolve because the topic is hot, but you evolve because you understand how this is in alignment with your brand and you're actually very strategic about it. So when you have your hands basically at the pulse of your brand, you can actually understand how to evolve. You can actually understand, how this actually, how your brand is supposed to engage with this. You don't engage with everything just because it's out there. You understand where it's important for you, and you understand the call for you. You understand the approach. You put things in place as well that both business wise and in terms of your reputation are actually feasible and actually meaningful and sensible to eventually execute. So and in some of these areas, if these are not things you're already looking at right now, I mean, your risk of having not just being relevant, but possibly having legal issues, some societies, and the awareness for some of these areas, especially when it comes to being sustainable, is a big deal right now. There are a lot of legislation, but we are in Nigeria, across Africa, globally around that, so these are some of important things as well, but just a few to highlight, but there's just more to it. But the most important thing here is when you have your hands at the pulse of your brand, you understand, you can project when to evolve, know when to actually adjust things, and then that will actually put you at the head of the curve. So how do you approach brand management? We've really looked at an overview of what brand management is, looked at why it's important, and then now how do you approach it? So you approach it first things first by knowing the signs. So when you know the signs of a poorly managed brand, then you can eventually know how to fix it. But before I go into this, I want to point out, knowing the signs doesn't mean you have to wait for the signs. So this is just, like to highlight, if you're still trying to wonder, okay, how do I even know if my brand is getting it right? What do I have to look for? If you want to be proactive and you're not just sitting to wait until you see negative brand sentiment, don't wait for negative brand sentiment, before you actually make an adjustment to your brand. You have to be proactive about it. But one of the things to look out for is negative brand sentiment. This is how people feel about your brand, whether it's publicly or privately. So when the overwhelming sentiment it's negative, it's a red flag and something is wrong, either in delivery, communication, or perception. So some of the things to look out for, you look out for easy things like subtweets, sarcasm, customer frustration in the comment sections, when um, people start, campaigns to boycott your brand, or their poor word of mouth, and then you have customer service rep constantly dealing with the same complaints over and over. You have low engagement despite high content output. So these are some of the things that you actually give an idea, you know, to make you understand when the brand is actually, having a negative sentiment. Then one of the things as well to look out for is inconsistent brand identity, obviously. So when you have inconsistent brand identity, you have inconsistent use of brand colors, fonts, photography style, or distorted logos. I gave the instance of Google without actually having the logo, but actually with a focus on the colors. 91% out of 2,500 consumers globally, not just in a particular country. And when I read through that article, the samples were actually the samples of the countries where the research, there were several research, but this is just one of the data I pulled out from that. They touched practically every planet. I think in Africa they primarily did South Africa, but basically that's a planet, every continent. They touched every continent. So there were countries like representation from in North America, South America, and so on and so forth. So like they touched practically every continent to ensure that they got that sample. And you can see how vast, where no matter the region, you still have up to 91% of consumers globally being able to recognize Google. So if your brand is inconsistent, when you have unbranded proposals or documents or pitch deck that doesn't look like your brand, that should be some of the things you should know that these are some of the signs that my brand is not being properly managed. And then, of course, there's lack of clear positioning. So when your communication is vague, let me not just go too much into it. If people are confused, when they start asking what exactly do you do, just know you're not clear. You've not been able to say what your brand does, who it's for, and why it's better or different. And that's how you position yourself. That's a clear positioning. And when that is not clear to your customers, you should be able to know that, there's something with how you're managing the brand, and it could be an issue of maybe you reversing your strategy, or to check if there is a misalignment within your strategy and your execution as well. And I'll go more into details about that. And then when your brand is actually reactive, not strategic, that means you're not really managing it. You're just letting it ride. You're not leading, So for instance, you're jumping on every trend, or you're actually doing stuff because a competitor is about to do stuff, or maybe there is a PR pressure. Oh, you have one negative review here, or there's something that has happened about your brand, you delayed the flight, and that delay has occurred for the past 3 weeks because of one issue. And by the time you're fixing it, you start giving people free tickets, you start doing promos just so that people feel good about it. While that can pacify, that's not an ideal way, to eventually effectively manage a brand. So So when you're reactive and you're not strategic, you're not proactive, basically, that is not good sign, for a good sign of good, or it's not a good sign. It shows your brand is being managed poorly. Then here again, we talk about culture. So if your team members can explain, your brand mission or values, there's no internal rituals, language, or culture that reflects the brand. Like I pointed out here in Futuresoft, we always talked about the fact that, say, there has to be continuous learning. You have to go the extra miles. These are things that, if you've been here for maybe 3 months, you must have heard over and over and over. You have to pay attention to details. So these are little things, we hear it over and over. They might seem simple when you hear things like that, but these things are deliberate. So some of these little things you need to understand that they go a long way to actually shape the mind of internal culture. So when you see where you find yourself in a team where they can't explain your values, there are no cultures, there are no languages that are constantly repeated, then you should understand, like, there's something you're doing wrong, and it's a sign to know that there's no proper management. When you have a weak internal culture, some of the things I've explained, to show, that okay, these are things you could just look out for to say these are we don't have a strong culture. So when you don't have a strong internal culture, you actually need to look into your management. So now you know the signs. I have some recommended steps. I want the list. I think there's just about 6 of them. But like I have to reiterate again, the science is just for you to understand some of the pointers to look at, when you want to, if you want to take that action right now to understand that, okay, I need to do better with my brand. So these are some of the things you should start looking out for to see that, okay, I'm having it wrong here, I'm having it wrong here. But when you at least see the signs, we recognize the signs. How do you eventually now approach, the actual brand management? So for me, I would always want to say you start with an audit. So the purpose of an audit isn't always just to look for one thing, and it's not just when you see, okay, let's say we have a poor internal culture, then let's go and fix it. Conducting an audit will help you understand, why we have that important internal culture. So it may not be your business, you could be a brand manager or someone in marketing or someone in a related department. So you have to understand sometimes brands actually have, very strong strategies in place, but sometimes there are misalignment in terms of, from strategy to execution, there's a lot of gap. And in which, when you conduct an audit, then you understand where the issue really lies. If the issue lies with not having the right strategy for certain things, or if the issue lies in executing the strategy and bringing it to life, then you understand where the misalignment is. I think that's where, why an audit is important. So there are a lot of things, you have to look out for as well, but I've listed a few here, which is one, you have to look out for your messaging across social media. You look out for web packaging, you look out for team communication, is there consistency? What you're saying on your social media or what you're saying on your website, is it really aligned with what's actually in your packaging? The way you communicate, when it comes to your team, the way you communicate the product value, is it actually reflective of the product value? Because whatever you communicate to your team, that's eventually what they will communicate. So you have to start looking for these things to see how you close the gap. So do our visuals also match our intended tone and positioning? So you say a brand that actually wants to elevate people. But when you look at your visuals, are your visuals really elevating people? If you say you want to be a brand that actually stands out from the crowd, you're for the 1% of the 1%. I mean, does the visuals really match being 1% of the 1%? When you say you want to be 1% of the 1%, but your visuals looks like the 99%. you know, so those are some of the mismatch you should start looking for. Are the customers as well getting the same experience? We promise them, so whatever you say you're going to deliver, if you say you're going to maybe provide tech support after they've purchased the product, are they really getting that tech support? Or after they've gotten the product, when they call a number or they send an email, there's no follow through, so what are people saying about us? How does that compare to, what we say about ourselves? So you also have to compare and contrast. So this is who we say we are. These things we say we're putting out, but what are the people saying? So you have to actually check to be sure that, they are balanced. And a quick pro tip, some of the pathways to do an audit, of course, through customer survey, Of course, it's customer benchmarking. You have to actually look at your competitor or substitute to see, what are they doing in this area? They're getting it right here. We're not getting it right here. So what are they doing? How can we do that? It's also social listening. There are a lot of digital tools you could use for this. And one of the one I could recall easily at the top of my head is Brand 24. You could just easily put in your brand, and it basically searches different social media platform. You put the one you want, and with your hashtags, your handles, and your details, and you see comments people are making about your brand. You'll be so shocked. And then I also know Google has something similar as well that helps you. I've forgotten the exact name. It helps you track, the number of searches you have. For instance, in Nigeria, if you put in the details. I'm trying to remember the Google tool. I've used it for the last time I used it was almost 2 years ago. I was working on something. It helps you track where your products are being searched. And you'll be so shocked, because I presented this to an actual client I was working for, but this was like on a private terms. The guy was so surprised, how come, his product had so much visibility in a particular region in Nigeria. He was so surprised, so you could actually use digital tools as well to help you see some of these things as well. But then for me, I would say for deeper analysis, and for objective evaluation, it's always smart to engage, a consultancy like us, because that way you're separated emotionally from the brand. Like the guy spoke about, it was still a shock to him because it was more or less like, how is it that they couldn't see this? And he was speaking to his brand manager. How is it that we couldn't see it? I was able to also point out like, fake accounts they had and stuff like that, and when you actually pay attention to your brand, you'll be able to spot these things. And these are some of the ways actually to help you uncover some areas that you have loopholes and for you to discover the opportunities as well you have in those areas, or basically like to locate threats and opportunities. Then, of course, when you've done your audit, so I'll say define or clarify your brand strategy. So for this, like I talked about the fact that sometimes you could have an effective strategy, but there could be a misalignment, and the misalignment could be, between strategy and execution. But for some cases, you may not actually have clearly defined strategy about certain things, or you might have strategies that are maybe not properly done, or they are misaligned with your evolution. So these are different things. So you have to actually clarify when you look at, when you conduct an audit to really check the sentiment, what you're saying and what people are saying, what your intention is and what you're really doing, So you go back to your strategy to see if your strategy is actually, in alignment. If there's a misalignment, then you figure out if it's a problem of execution or if it's a problem of realigning your strategy, but some of the key basics of strategy I've just listed there, these are not all, there's a lot more you need to look into, but of course you need to understand your vision, where you're going and what the future you want to create will look like, your mission, what you're doing every day to get there, the values, what beliefs drives your decisions and behavior, your position as well, who you're for and how you're different from them, and what others are doing in the space, your tone and personality. If your brand were a person, how would it speak? That's the best way to summarize it. So this is just some of the key aspects of strategy to look at, but there are brands where you see they have a mission, they have values, but there's no vision. And I find that strange. For some brands, you talk about positioning and it's like, what do you mean? Positioning statement. You don't even have a positioning statement. And yet that's really core in defining your brand and who it's for. And when you're telling some people about the tone and personality, they feel like you're just trying to be super creative, you know, when in reality, most of the brands, we are tuned to, one of the things that actually drives, them is the archetype, they've actually decided to embody, that's where your tone and personality basically lie. So here's a scenario. I've just painted a scenario of what, let's say, typical tech startup would be: a vision, a mission, a positioning, and so on. But I won't go into details of that. Maybe when the slides are available, you can look through and just see that for yourself. And then when you're done with your audit and you've actually redefined or defined or clarified your strategy, the next thing is to actually consider a guideline. And here I've said develop brand guidelines and actually use them. It's important because a lot of organizations do have brand guides, but they don't use them. So they just do whatever works, just go with the flow. So but Basically, brand guidelines are not just necessary for visuals, in as much as some of the key components of common brand guidelines involve logo usage, typography, roles, color palettes, breakdown. There's also photography style, tone of voice and writing styles, or layout system and so on. Basically, just the do's and don'ts of the brand. So there is so much more. For some brands, they have multiple guides. You could have, customer experience guides. You could have, like I've listed here, writing style guides. You could have a guide that actually clearly define your tone. If you need people to get into a particular mood to write for you, if you need them to actually pay attention to certain things, you can actually create guides for practically everything. You can actually create guide on how you want your drivers, your dispatch riders, to write. If there are specific ways you want them to write, if there are specific rules you want them to adhere to, you can create guides for every single thing for your brand. But here's something you need to note. So you don't just go through your audit, clarify your strategy, and then you just jump right into creating a guide. So if you go through your audits, you clarify your strategy and you realize that you're evolving from what you used to be, or there's no clarity. When you're clarifying your brand, you're clarifying your strategy, depending on how the outcome is aligned to to where you are. So that's what determines if you create a guideline. So if you go through your strategy, you go through everything, you realize that, okay, no, our strategy is on point. We just need to structure execution, better. You can create guides along that. But by the time you're doing your audit, if you realize that you're evolving as a brand and where you are no longer suits where you used to be, but because you've not paid attention, now you're realizing that you're really evolving. So you don't feel, oh, what happens if I go in and I realize that, okay, we had everything right, but now it looks like we're moving away. Then that's where you start to talk about a brand refresh or a rebrand. For some cases, you just have to consider an entire refresh. You don't necessarily have to rebrand. You just need to readjust certain things. Then for some cases, you're not just looking at a brand refresh. There has to be a total rebrand. So, and in that case, whatever guidelines you're creating should be reflective of the direction of where the brand is headed. If there's a refresh, it has to reflect the new direction. If there's a rebrand, it has to reflect the new direction. So the guide is not necessarily static. So if you're talking about creating a guide, it should reflect the outcome of your audit and the outcome of clarifying and redefining your strategy. So that's the whole purpose of creating a guideline. So one, let me spend a bit of time to explain this. So one, you create a guideline based on the fact that your audit and strategy are in alignment with where you are, where you need to be. You just need more structure. And then if you realize you're evolving, depending on the level of evolution, you can actually opt for a brand refresh or you can opt for a total rebrand. So those are like the three approaches towards approaching creating this guide. So yeah, so they are strictly dependent on the strategy, the outcome of your audit and the outcome of your strategy. So very important. And this is why it's also important as well to engage consultancy to help you walk through the process and help you craft it effectively so that there is, perfect alignment and there is seamlessness in executing the brand. So I think that does this for this. Then four, we talk about culture. Again, one of the ways to actually keep your brand running smoothly is to run internal brand workshops and onboarding sessions. For everybody that joins the team, I always, walk them through our brand, walk them through certain things. Oh, there are fonts we have, but oh, this is when we use that font. You don't just use that font for every communication. Oh, this is the family values. Ensure you read through the family values. These are our decks. This is this. These are this. Walk them through basically, of the do's and don'ts. I do that for everybody who comes in. So there should be internal brand workshops and onboarding session. So you should reinforce your brand values during team meetings. And I talk about this, Ken says this a lot. There has to be continuous learning. You have to pay attention to details, so you have to go the extra mile when it comes to this. If this is not working at this particular point, what can you do? You have to be innovative. So we see these things repeated, internally as well as a team. So you need to reinforce those brand values every now and then. It's not just good enough to write them, store them in a place and just share them with the team, but you need to reinforce it consistently, when you're on board. Then, of course, celebrating brand aligned behavior across departments will also be a good way to actually help, your team to understand, that, the brand is actually as important, as the product and the business itself. And then, of course, you should create internal brand champion who ensures the brand stays alive. and consistent in daily decisions and executions. And in our case, yeah, I'm the one. If there is something wrong somewhere, I'm the one who always gets the fire. So it's more or less like, okay, why is this way? Have you ever seen this? So and it's important actually to ensure that we have consistency across our brand. So these are some of the things you can do for internal culture to ensure that it's aligned. And when you think about it, graded brand experience is a byproduct of brand aligned employee behavior, and no Canva template or clever caption can fix that. If you have a very strong brand culture, you're going to actually have a very great, customer experience, great brand experience in general. So when you have great brand experiences, byproduct of an important of say a brand aligned culture. And that brand aligned culture is actually developed by deliberate, effective, and conscious management. Yeah. Then also, in all of this as well, measure was key. So it's not just enough that people can recognize you. It's not just enough that people can actually be okay with the things you do, but how much are people really aware of your brand? Because you can be doing things perfectly, but if people are not aware of your brand, then you're really getting it wrong. Then, of course, I talked about brand sentiment. Initially, you have to actively get customer feedback. There's social listening, surveys, and reviews. You have to actively and objectively get customer feedback to really know, how they feel about you. Then, of course, you need to, from time to time, also check your net promoter score, the measure of customer loyalty. How willing are your customers to promote you? So you need to carry out exercises from time to time like this, from region to region, depending on how vast your business are, your business, the range or coverage of your business, your reach. You need to carry out exercise like this to check, your awareness level, your sentiment level. You need to check your net promoter score to see, out of the 100% of, a sample base of your customer, how many percent are really willing to recommend you to another person, and that's how you build. Of course, you need to check customer retention and repeat purchase rates as well. Then again, you still have to check internal brand alignment. In as much as you're enforcing it in meetings, you're saying it over and over, you still need to from time to time check, employee surveys to track engagement levels to be sure this thing is really sinking. So it's not just good enough to reinforce it, it's not just good enough to celebrate people on it, but you really need to check to be sure that the average person gets it. The average person, the least person in the organization actually gets what this brand is about. So you need to also do that as well to ensure that everyone is actually fully on board. So yeah, I think that's it for this. Here I'm just only saying for the pro tip, don't just measure outputs like how many posts did we create, measure outcomes like, how did this improve perception or recall, so from the things people see on the comments. So it's not just looking at, the search volumes, the mentions, what are the things people say? When people say things that is actually a recall from the past, or I remember when you did this, or I remember that your product, I do this, like when people say things that shows that they are really engaged, so it's not just also paying attention to the fact that people are saying, because if you do a post promotion or you run a campaign, people will talk, but you also have to actually sieve through that, the awareness, and to see how much are they really, in tune with your brand. Are they just hearing about it for the first time? Or, okay, these are people who actually already know. And what's the percentage of people from the comments we're seeing that is actually just hearing about us for the first time, or that is really understanding this aspect of our service? And how many people seem to already be aware of the process, and not just aware of the process, how many people can really use this feature or this product? How many people are really engaging with it? How many people are really purchasing? So you should be looking out for those things when carrying out your surveys, when carrying out your reviews, when carrying out your research as well, to see how it's really impacting the brand, so it's very important to note those things. Then I talked about evolution. So some of the things to note, when to evolve is, when your audience is changing, and I'll give Indomie as an example. Indomie has been an interesting brand. They kept evolving with their customer base. They kept creating bigger sizes of the Indomie noodle pack, and at the initial point when they were doing this, I when they started doing this, I wasn't into this space. I didn't understand, you know, it was, getting more exposure, I started realizing, oh, both even like watching the ads, I started realizing, when you watch the Indomie ads from the early days, they used more of kids. But as the ads went on, you start to realize, they start having products. You see the Indomie for this, that, it started becoming more of a family meal and stuff like that. So this is some of the things you look into as well. How to evolve, you need to increase the size of your product because you realize, okay, you're no longer serving kids. The kids you start selling to, they are becoming adults right now. And now they're stuck on this product. They still want to buy it even as they're adults. You have to create something for them. Of course, you have to look at when there are cultural and tech shifts, to alter how people engage with brands. So imagine being in 2025 right now, you don't have a mobile responsive website. I don't even think that's possible. I don't think that's even possible right now. But just imagine how strange it to be. And what I'm saying is, I remember back in the day when we used to browse with Java phones and Opera Mini, their website you visit, as far back as 2010 that they have mobile versions, but there were some you would visit then, you still actually appear like desktops, the way they will appear on desktop. And even for some, you have restrictions like you can't actually view because your device is not compatible, but those are things, I'm sure, like I said, I doubt it's possible for me to I have not seen. I don't know if it's possible right now to have a non-mobile responsive website, but that's just one of the quick things to explain, but over time as well in customer service, a lot of people are incorporating chatbots to see how chatbots help optimize, message response, whether you're sending messages on Twitter, you're sending messages on Instagram. For some organizations, when you send messages to them, to make complaints, you realize that you're not getting response from an actual human. You realize you're getting response from a bot, and for some of those cases, they'll tell you, okay, because there is no active customer rep right now, you just drop your message. If it's not something, that's within the organized menu that can actually be automated, then they'll ask you to drop a message. When you drop a message, and uh, good enough, quite a number of brands have actually had to use that way. Like, they respond promptly. You find yourself where maybe you're sending a message by 8 o'clock in the night because you need a quick answer and it's not within their automated system. By the time you drop your message, as early as sometimes 6 a.m., 7, and for some cases by 8, you're already getting response from an actual rep. So those are some of the things you actually look out for, to evolve a brand. For some cases as well, it's about visuals. I talked about Google, the color has been consistent, but I think it was easy in 2015, Google actually switched their logo from the serif font to the sans serif font, which is more smooth and more modern, but still retaining the structure and also the color elements of their logo. And even after they did that, they also, I think, yeah, it was during the process of that rebrand, they actually created the G, that G, and incorporates all the Google colors, inside that G. And that was also because of responsiveness for like smaller devices, because they're having watches that could actually perform functions like mobile phones. So things like that are things you look out, for how to improve your visuals, how to improve your customer service based on the shift in culture and technology and how customers engage with brands. Then, of course, when new competition makes your positioning less effective, there are people who their sole purpose is to disrupt the market. We've seen that in Nigeria, you know. There are people their sole purpose is just to disrupt the market, and when you find yourself in that position where, the way you've positioned yourself, you have brands that are coming solely to disrupt the market. And for some, I wouldn't even say they are trying to disrupt the market, they are basically just trying to destroy it. Sorry for saying this, but I have a specific brand in mind that I think did that in Nigeria. They're just coming to disrupt the market and they're not there for the long haul. They just want to tap into that market. So for things like that, you should be able to anticipate, look ahead, and see how you also evolve as well to ensure that you don't fall prey into losing relevance. Then, of course, when your current image no longer reflects your vision or your offering, for that case, brands sometimes they leave their vision to the fullest and they come to a point where they need to move into something else. And that's because maybe they started out small. I remember reading about Taxify. It was just supposed to be like a cab hailing service, but over time, they kept expanding and they started adding, electric scooters. They started adding other form of services, and it became just beyond tax hailing. It became more about mobility, and then also they started being more eco-conscious as well. with the electric scooters, using bikes, some of these services available in like, some areas in Europe and not in Nigeria. But some of those services, they're increasing the services as well in Nigeria. But well, when it became more about mobility and just less about cab hailing, they had to evolve as well. And also given the fact that they were eco-friendly, like, or eco-forward, if that's the term to use, so they had to actually do an entire rebrand basically. So the brand has to evolve basically from Taxify to Bolt, and that Bolt was really like anchored around the green energy and the electric scooter, the whole idea of Bolt being like, electric, the symbol of electricity spark, or so to speak, so that's how basically they evolve. So and then rebranding or refreshing with internal changes is not just it's just a costume change. So if you're evolving, it has to be real and it has to reflect growth. It shouldn't be out of panic. So don't just change because people are changing. It has to reflect an internal growth. So if this no longer feels like you, then you really have to evolve and you really have to move into the new heights. So I think that sums it up. So for my final thoughts, I would say brand management is not a campaign. It's a commitment. It's an ongoing art and science. I talked about before that it's a combination of creativity, strategy, and execution. So it's an ongoing art and science of shaping perception, building trust, and delivering, on promises. So and then getting right from end means you're not only showing up, you're showing up with clarity, you're showing up with purpose, and you're consistent every single time. And then no matter who you are, whether you're a founder, a brand manager, I don't think of brand management as a cost, but see it more or less as a growth lever, because when you manage your brand right, it does more than sell. It inspires, it endures, and it leads. So let the work begin for those of you responsible managing a brand. So thank you. And if you have questions, now will be a perfect time to take them. Thank you, everyone. Questions, the floor is open for questions.
All right, thank you so much, David, for this enlightening session. So in the absence of questions, we can now bring the session to an end. Please note that this video will be available on our YouTube channel. And if you have questions while watching the video, you can drop them in the comment section. I'll be very happy to answer your questions. Join us next time for another session. Have a lovely day. Bye, everyone.